Kids were wearing hand-me-downs and playing games men kick around.
But by the 1970s, Fordism was in a global crisis. It led to dismantling of the system, introduction of post-Fordism by 1980. So the causes of the crisis were on another slide too. Big deal energy shocks that happened, like now. We've had a few. Who knows if this will be a major one again. But the big thing was that the Middle East, which controls the vast bulk of global oil reserves, I think the United States has 6% of the entire 3% of all of the global oil reserves. I have a slide about that in the next series. And you know, the bulk of what we have left to us is in the Middle East. So when the OPEC cartel formed and limited production and increased prices, managed prices, it led to shortages and dramatic price increases that really put a shock to the global system, to the American system at least, was so much dependent upon cheap energy. So the rise of low-cost global competitors to Fordist corporations is another problem. After World War II, the United States was virtually the only major industrial power that hadn't been bombed flat, right? And so for about 30 years, 20 years really, 25 years, the United States had an advantage over Japan and over Germany and over Britain and over really all of Europe, because we didn't have the industrial destruction that had happened. But the difference had been erased, and actually by the 1970s, the newly built efficient plants of these other nations were outcompeting and creating higher quality products at often lower prices, which put pressure on the big Fordist corporations in America. All right. You saw plummeting corporate profits then. You should just write this down real fast. The stock market between 1970 and 1980 was flat. There had been fluctuations within that decade, but we had a decade of no capital gains for stock on average. Okay. So what's really interesting about that, if you just sort of come out of the decade where the same thing has happened, right? 2001, I think, was the date of the absolute high of the Dow, and I don't think we've been back there again. We've been well short of it, actually, for a long time. So we've had about a decade now. This has happened again. Plants closed, increased unemployment. So we saw this steady degradation of working class employment, not because of anything internal, but because the global system was beginning to eat away and make it more difficult for corporations to compete and for a nation state to control. Economic stagflation. This is a big deal. You don't hear this term very often. But stagflation was what happened in America in the 1970s and in other European or industrial countries. Stagflation occurs when you have high price inflation coupled with economic recession. So prices are increasing for everything, for housing, for food, for energy. Prices are going up, but employment is going down. So one of the things that happens is that corporations not facing global competition became rather complacent. And one of the things, again, in America at least, the working classes had no voice at all in what was being produced. So corporations were making decisions about what was being produced, and the market was now being flooded by products. So you get a break, and so this is what we're going to head to. That here, we'll come back to this here in a second. But none of this works here. Let's go back. I'll just draw it. Sorry. Okay. So remember Fordism and that cycle, mass production, mass consumption. Workers can buy the products they make. Well, in post-Fordism, what happens is that people who have money to consume, are they buying the products that they make? Answer, no. They're buying products that are made anywhere. And so instead of having the kind of cycle of production and consumption, you have a national economy that's being managed for full employment. You have now a global economy that's not being managed by anyone, in which consumption can be of products produced anywhere. The profits produced can go anywhere, right? And so you have a break in this national economy. You have a global economy instead. So one of the things that I have another slide that says it, that what post-Fordism is then is another great separation. So this leads to something called the fiscal crisis of the state then. So one of the things that happens, these Fordist economies, like the United States and others, they're using the government as a mechanism to stabilize consumption. And under Fordism, if you support someone with a little bit of income, they're going to spend it on products that are made within the system. So that's going to enhance employment again, right? So consumption and production are linked together. But in the 1970s, as globalization began to really escalate, the money that was being used to support unemployed workers wasn't necessarily being spent on products that were going to enhance the employment of the system. So that you were having an inability for the national government to regulate the economy. You couldn't do it. You pour all the money you want into the pockets of working people, and it wasn't going to spur employment again, because the workers are buying things made elsewhere, right? So we wound up with this fiscal crisis where you couldn't sustain it, you couldn't tax enough to pay for it, you started making extra money, which is helping increase the inflation, that kind of fiscal crisis. So if Fordism was a world in which a social democratic government regulated the economy for full employment, Post-Fordism is a world in which corporations force or encourage government downsizing and deregulation in order to increase corporate profit. So it is deregulation for profit. This is not a left-wing distortion of what neoliberalism is. This is a statement of fact of exactly what it is. It is a deregulation for profit. Always was. And part of what happens in the 1980s is you get a celebration of profit making. The primary goal, again, is to keep profits and capital values high by keeping inflation low, even if that meant keeping unemployment high, as it often does. High unemployment prevents price inflation, which allows inflation or interest rates to remain low. So in order to keep inflation low, we often have to keep unemployment relatively high. And when unemployment gets low in America and employment is very full, that puts upward pressure on wages, which begins to raise interest rates, or inflation rates, which causes an increase in interest rates. So if you have as a goal low interest rates, employment is a problem, and you actually have to have a certain level of unemployment that's normal to keep inflation in check. So that's one of the things that happens. So rather than a fully employed economy, monetarism implies an economy with a safety valve of unemployed people, a permanent group of unemployed people, a reserve army who's present and capable of taking jobs in case anyone tries to increase wages anywhere. In the early 1970s, the corporate leaders who felt themselves to be particularly pressured by global capitalism organized and began colluding with each other to control the political process in America. Now, most of us, when we think about capitalism, think about competition and companies that compete against each other, that benefit us, the consumer, but companies are always in competition with each other. In the early 1970s, an organization was formed called the Business Roundtable. It was one of only of a number of organizations that were formed during this period that worked as a coordinating committee of various capitalist enterprises.